Testing on the Mac. Cornell here, doing the third section of the motivation notes, which is on sex. Since I'm a little behind in the recordings and I've recorded myself twice today and it didn't even save, and hopefully this is not the third time and you'll get this, I'm not going to do the pauses and write everything down. I'm just going to say it. So if you haven't wrote everything, go write it and then watch the video, or you can pause the video as you go through, whatever you'd like to do. All right, so this one's about sexual motivation. So for all but the few considered asexual, dating and mating is a high priority in life. Asexual means having no sexual attraction to others. So sexual motivation comes from two different things, physiology and psychology. So the physiology is the physical, biological part of our body and stuff. And then psychology is, the mind, culture, environment, stuff like that. So sexual motivation encourages procreation and thus our species survival. But it is not a need. So unlike people may tell you or something like that, it is not something you'll die without, like hunger. You would die without food type thing. So among the forces that drive sexual behavior are the sex hormones. So the main male sex hormone is testosterone. The main female sex hormone is estrogen. So testosterone, these are long definitions for testosterone and estrogen. So make sure you get them down. Testosterone is the most important male sex hormone. Both males and females have it, but obviously guys have more of it. And what it does is it stimulates the growth of the male sex organs during the fetal period. So while you're in the womb growing and developing, that testosterone makes male sex organs grow, and the development of male sex characteristics during puberty, which is everything from voice changes, increased hair growth on your arms, back, stuff, all that kind of thing. Estrogens. Now, this is where I learned something new. I thought it was just estrogen. I didn't realize it was plural. But it's a bunch of different sex hormones. And the main one, I don't know if I'm saying this right because I just learned it, estradiol, you may have heard of it. I never had. Secreted in greater amounts by females. So again, females and males have it, but females have more, and contributes to the female sex characteristics. So similar to what you just wrote. Another kind of interesting thing is in non-human female mammals, this estrogen level peaks during ovulation, promoting sexual receptivity. So if you've ever heard of like an animal being in heat or something like that, if you've had a dog or a cat or something, you've had to keep male animals away from them because you didn't want a bunch of babies or litter of puppies or whatever like that. That's what they're talking about right here. So sex hormones do a lot. In prenatal development, they direct us to develop and grow as male or female with our sex organs. They control and direct puberty and adolescence, and they influence sexual behavior after puberty. So one of the main people to study sex was gynecologist and obstetrician William Masters and his collaborator Virginia Johnson. They study men and women's sexual interactions and developed the sexual response cycle. So the sexual response cycle is a 4-stage of sexual responding described by Masters and Johnson. And the 4 steps are excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. So you see I got the chart right there for you down here. And then that's a picture of Masters and Johnson. They also came upon something called a refractory period, which is after their sexual response cycle. It's a resting period after orgasm during which a man cannot achieve another orgasm. So Masters and Johnson sought to not only describe the sexual response cycle, but also understand it and treat someone's inability to complete it. So after they described it and learned all about it, then they wanted to see if they could help fix problems within it. And so those are known as sexual dysfunction. So a problem that consistently impairs sexual arousal or functioning. Also got a video right here you can watch that kind of goes more in depth on the sexual response cycle. And your book goes more in depth on it and stuff too. So the two main sexual dysfunctions, there's one for males, one for females. The main one for males are erectile disorder, which is the inability to develop or maintain an erection due to insufficient blood flow to the penis. The female orgasmic disorder is distress due to infrequently or never experiencing orgasm. They looked into therapy like behavioral therapy, cognitive therapy, stuff like that. And they did find that when you make different associations or get conditioned a certain way or change your thinking and your thought patterns and stuff, they could kind of solve some of these issues people had. And I hope it's not cut off on your screen, but it looks like some of these might be cut off. So I might have to go fix that. All right. Then your book talks about paraphilias, which I don't know. I guess I wish it didn't or something, but anyways, it was sexual arousal from fantasies or behaviors or urges that involve non-human objects, the suffering of self or others, and or non-consenting persons, which I was like, ah. And so if you've ever heard of a pedophile or pedophilia or something like that, that would be, sexual urges, behaviors with prepubescent, like children, basically people before puberty. And so that would be why it's a pedophile and pedophilia and stuff like that. That's what they're talking about. And there's a bunch of different types. I do not encourage you to fall down that rabbit hole. Then your book talks about STDs or STIs. Now, I'm always going to call it an STD because I think when I went through health class in middle school, that's what they taught me. So it's really hard to like change my mind. But, the acronym for me is STD, sexually transmitted disease. They also call it sexually transmitted infections, and they're pretty much the same thing. And I thought this was a crazy stat, and this is kind of an old stat, so it could be even more. Again, hopefully it's not cut off on yours, but more than 1 million people acquire an STD every single day worldwide, which is wild. Now, it varies, right? I mean, some are not a big deal, and then some can be life-threatening. Some can be easily cured. Some are non-curable. So it just kind of depends. Obviously, the easier ones and more curable ones are more common, thankfully. But, you never know. And then it talks about how teen girls are more susceptible or vulnerable to this. Again, in 2008, which is kind of an old stat, so probably it's scarily a little higher. 40% of girls aged 14 to 19 had an STD. Let's see. Oh no, is my computer freezing? There we go. So not all types of protection, like birth control and stuff, protect from STDs. So for example, condoms only protect against some STDs, not all. Female birth control pills don't protect against any STDs. That's more about pregnancy and stuff. And then your book talks about some specific ones, like the worst one, I guess, the most unfortunately deadly one and stuff like that is AIDS, which stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. And it doesn't have to be sexually transmitted, but the majority of it is. That's how the majority of people get AIDS. And so it's a life-threatening sexually transmitted infection caused by HIV. And HIV stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus. AIDS depletes the immune system, leaving the person vulnerable to infection. So basically what AIDS does, it's not like AIDS itself kills you, but AIDS itself kills your immune system, which then could let anything else kill you. Things that a normal person would be able to easily fight off over time, someone with HIV, someone with AIDS couldn't. And that's why they, have like a premature death or stuff like that. Is it going to freeze up on me every time it's time to click? At least it's letting me film, right? Okay. So so now we're going to move in. All that was physiology of sex. Now we're going to look at psychology of sex. So while biological factors influence sexual motivation, the variations over time, place, and people show the influence of psychological factors. So how people think, feel, all that about sex shows the psychology behind it. Your book talks about how external or imagined stimuli can influence sexual arousal. And then your book also talks about teen pregnancy and like some factors that contribute to that, maybe like lack of communication about what protection can offer, or availability of protection. If they don't feel like they can ask their mom or get to a doctor or something, they don't have anything, like birth control pills or something maybe. Alcohol or drug use, like taking that back to Unit 2, you know how that, like it reduces inhibitions and stuff like that and leads to things that maybe wouldn't normally happen. And the media has normalized it. TV shows from 16 and Pregnant to all the other sitcoms and stuff, movies. If you listen to lyrics and songs, it normalizes like teens having sex and even teen pregnancy and stuff like that. Sorry, I got a little tracked off. I'm going to come out of this real fast and see if I'm still recording. Oh, good. I'm just freaked out I'm not, because I did it so many times. And I needed to see this little thing right here. So, and that's why I got to talking weird in the last one, because it got in my head like, are you even recording? You don't see that thing. So let's pop back into it. So yeah, so your book talks about teen pregnancy. Studies have found that this I thought was kind of interesting. Studies have found that people who wait until later in life to have sex actually report greater relationship satisfaction and sexual satisfaction. So cultures differ in their beliefs regarding sex. That's a no-brainer, right? Some cultures think it's acceptable to marry off a girl as young as 12 to go be with an older man and have babies and stuff like that. There's 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds. I mean, there's places in the world that would like crazy disgust us, right? And then some cultures are very staunchly against it, from living together before marriage, any sexual relations before marriage, like absolutely nothing. And since there's so many cultures in the United States, like you think of all the countries people came from, all their family members, religious, affiliation, stuff like that. people's values and beliefs about sex, it just differs from person to person, and it can be very, very different from person to person. Come on. I don't know why it's being slow. It's never done this in a presentation. It's because it knows I want it to go. All right, so the next part of your notes, we did physiology of sex, we did psychology of sex. Now let's look at sexual orientation. Now this is pretty interesting because back when I taught AP psychology in 2009, which in some ways feels like a lifetime ago, this was not something that they covered. And I guess the book would have been a couple years older than that. So 10, 15, 20 years ago, this was not something anyone was teaching about. So I thought it was kind of cool that this was like something we teach about. And I went and looked in your standards, and like it's in the standards for AP psychology. So probably wouldn't be on like this year's exam, but it could definitely pop up on an exam when there's like 100 multiple choice questions, because it's one of the things that they want us to teach about. So I just thought it was interesting because I don't think they teach about this really in any class. But so you probably know what sexual orientation is. It's an enduring sexual attraction to members of one's own sex, which would be homosexual, the other sex or opposite sex, which is heterosexual, or both sexes, which is bisexual. Another thing I found interesting is your book talks about people overestimate the amount of people that identify as homosexual. So people guess like 10 to 20% of the population is homosexual, but studies have found it's nowhere near that. It's much like 2 to 4%. Now, the interesting thing is, I mean, if it was 10 to 20%, that's 1 out of every 10 people you know, or 20%, 1 out of every 5 people you know, which I think we know, there's a fair amount of, homosexuals, but I don't think it's 1 out of every 5 people. That would be like hundreds and hundreds of hundreds that you would know. And so people kind of overestimate it. But then it's interesting, your book says this could be too low too. So the number could actually be maybe somewhere in the middle, because studies have found that it's 2 to 4%. But what if the person they were interviewing, surveying, studying, whatever, came from a less tolerant culture, whether it's their culture, their environment, their family, their friends, their marriage, whatever. If someone's in like a situation, they might actually lie and say they're not. And so self-reported attitudes might actually be less than what's real. So the number's probably somewhere in the middle, probably nowhere near as high as this, but could definitely be higher than that. About less than 1% of the population actually identifies as bisexual. Cultures, again, talking about how they vary in their acceptance of sex. Well, they vary in their acceptance of homosexuality. So again, there's some places that are 100%, like it's fine. There are places 0%, they put people to death really easily, and it's pretty widespread, 0% accepting of it. So places like in Africa, I think Nigeria is the one in your book talks about the least accepting place. Places in the Middle East and Asia, they tend to be less accepting. And then Western cultures or European, America, stuff like that tend to be more. Now, America is not the most accepting culture, which I don't know if that surprises you or not, but there's definitely places in Europe, European countries that are way more accepting of homosexuality than America. America's probably at like, if you put them on a spectrum from 0 to 100%, probably at like the 2/3, 3/4 mark, stuff like that for acceptance, because there's still quite a few people, who don't accept it in America. And since it's not as common as heterosexuality, many homosexuals attempt to either hide it or fight it. Like fight against their feelings and like try and not be it, or they just hide it and lie, stuff like that, especially in adolescence, which is kind of a, a tumultuous time anyways, for fear of being bullied or isolated from friends or family. I mean, there's families that disown and stuff like that. So, fear against that. There have been various types of therapy that people have tried to change someone's sexual orientation, from behavior modification to religious therapies. None of them have proven successful in changing one's sexual orientation. So because of this, the field of psychology today accepts that sexual orientation is neither willfully chosen or changed. Now, I got the today in there because that is super interesting. This change has only come about probably within like my lifetime for sure, but it's not been forever. Remember those DSMs, those diagnostic statistical manuals we talked about for Unit 8 with the psychological disorders, and it classifies all the mental disorders, tells you how to treat them and stuff like that, case studies on them. They always had homosexuality in there for the first couple editions. So up through the 40s, 50s, 60s, probably even 70s. I don't know about 80s. I don't know when it changed to be exact, but that's probably a time it had homosexuality as a psychological disorder and something that needed to be treated and fixed and stuff like that. Like, something that was wrong with the person. So it's kind of interesting that psychology, the field of psychology started off like that, but today they've changed their stance on it. There is opposition, as you're aware, just from being out and about in the real world, to same-sex couples raising children. However, interesting, and so I guess people think if two men raise a son, he'll grow up to be gay. If two women raise a daughter, she'll grow up to be a lesbian, or vice versa, or whatever. But studies have shown that's not the case. It goes with the normal data. And so most raised by homosexual parents identify as heterosexual, because what you just saw a couple slides ago, the vast majority of people are heterosexual, you know, whether it's 2 to 4%, all the way up to 10%, whatever. The vast majority out of children identify as heterosexual. So again, it's going to match just normal data. The vast majority of children of same-sex couples are going to identify as heterosexual. Which disproves the whole environmental factors. People think the environment they're in, the people you're around, stuff like that can make you. And actually leans more to a biological component. Like they're just biologically predisposed, you know, to be one way or another type thing. Come on, computer. I get like in a roll and then it does this to me. Should I click it again? Okay, good. So peer influence has also been shown to have no relationship on sexual orientation. So just because a guy has a lot of guy friends doesn't necessarily mean he'll turn out to be gay or anything like that. Same thing with girls and girls. Same-sex behaviors have been found in animals. And this was kind of interesting, talking about that genetic biological component. So your book talks in detail about the brain. You should check it out. Talking about different parts of the brain, looking at brain scans of brain activity, brain responses, and it mainly focuses on the hypothalamus. Also talking about like autopsies of people who are heterosexual and homosexual after death, looking at their brain, and they found some differences in the hypothalamus, which they think maybe means there's some type of genetic component. So as brain scans show, there does appear to be a genetic component in homosexuality, and homosexuality often runs in families. So that kind of shows more of a biological link. Also, twin studies have shown us some type of biological link, because identical twins are more likely to be of the same sexual orientation. Your book also talks about, now this is kind of interesting and could be out there, doesn't really know yet, but starting to look at prenatal hormones, like the prenatal environment, if that has any effect on sexual orientation. So if certain hormones get received during like some critical time period, certain amounts, too much, too less, whatever, if that has anything on maybe brain development, which could then correlate with sexual orientation. And they're not really sure, but it's kind of what they're looking at. It's kind of like their focus of study right now. So then you got this biopsychosocial approach. So we've had this picture pretty much in every thing we've talked about so far. And so with sexual motivation, let's talk about how the three go together. So biologically, someone's maturity, their hormones, stuff like that. Psychologically is just like what's going on kind of in their mind and stuff, conditions, fantasies. And then sociocultural, so this is the environment. So what are the family values? What's the expectations type thing? Religious, personal values, society, what culture do they live in, basically? And what's the media telling them, acceptable or not? So as stated earlier, values and beliefs regarding sex are both cultural and personal. Even how a person talks about sex can show you how they feel about their beliefs. So there are two kind of main cultural similarities across the world, across time, place, all that. Men tend to have a pretty constant sex drive, and it tends to be higher than females, and it pretty much remains constant through the majority of their life, until they get much older or something happens or whatever. But women, their sex drive tends to fluctuate. So sometimes it's higher than a man's, but most of the time it's lower, and then it can be much lower, and then it can come up. So I guess it just depends on maybe like seasons of their life, what they're going through, maybe stress, children, stuff like that, maybe have a bigger impact on women. Not really sure why. It just kind of talks about it's interesting how it changes. And that when it comes to sex, women tend to prefer sex in a committed relationship over men. All right, so that's it for that one. I'll be back for your last one. See you later. Bye.